Mr. Smallwood, you were talking last time about the present Premier's confrontational attitude or approach to Ottawa over the oil ownership question. And you were talking about, you mentioned his day of mourning and the other various public displays of his feelings. How is his attitude or his handling of Ottawa different from your attitude or handling of Ottawa in the late 1950s over term 29 of the Terms of Union, when you also had a day of mourning and the students at Memorial had the coffin parade and so on?
The students had this parade. They had a coffin draped in black. And that was entirely their own. I knew nothing in the wide world about it until one day I got a telephone call, well, the day it happened, a telephone call saying the students had all marched from the university to the Colonial Building and were now assembled, a big crowd of them, in front of the Colonial Building. Would I come and speak to them? What could I do but go? And I didn't hesitate anyway. I was quite pleased, in fact, to go. And I went there, and I'm rather proud of what I did. You know, if you're a politician and you have 1,000 or a couple of thousand or 1,500 people there in front of you, a captive audience who have asked you to come, who have telephoned to your office, your instinct as a politician is to please them, is to agree with them, is to join forces with them. But here they were with their placards, their signs, hammering blazes out of Ottawa. In short, hammering blazes out of Canada, out of Confederation. And I am rather proud of the fact that I resisted the temptation just to join with them and insisted on telling them, look, you've got no quarrel with Canada, you've got no quarrel with the Parliament of Canada, you've got a quarrel, it's true, with Mr. Diefenbaker, one man. And that man happens to be the Prime Minister of Canada, but he's still only one man. And certainly the Canadian nation, the Canadian Parliament, the Canadian people, you have no quarrel with. It's a wrong decision by the Prime Minister. Blame him. I blame him. I'm glad that you're blaming him, but limited to blame of one man for his terribly mistaken decision, his mistaken judgment. As a matter of fact, you know, I learned afterwards that the statement that he read out in the House of Commons, he read out without having read it before, without knowing what was in it, and that he realized before he was half through, he couldn't stop, he had to keep on reading it to the end, that he himself realized he was making a ghastly mistake in this statement that had been handed him. Of course, he made the big mistake of not reading it. He ought to have read it. But now he was stuck with it, having read it. It was his statement. The people of Canada would assume that it was his statement. He read it, it must be his. But it wasn't his. And he disagreed with it. But he was stuck with it. And it was a calamitous thing. Calamitous. It gave an awful lot of people in Newfoundland and those students who marched down Harvey Road from the university, where the old campus was, to the Colonial Building, they had a case. After all, do you distinguish too much between the Prime Minister of Canada, the Government of Canada, the Parliament of Canada, the people of Canada, Canada? Do you differentiate? They didn't. I did, because I was a Canadian. I was proud to be a Canadian. I was a grateful Canadian, and I didn't want those young men and women, a large number of them, filled the yard in front of the colonial building. I didn't want them to turn anti-Canadian. I felt that when the people of Canada and when the Parliament of Canada would have the facts, the truth, the reality laid before them, they would be against Mr. Diefenbaker and on Newfoundland's side, which is what turned out to be the case in fact. And I think that this would be the case. Appeal to them. Don't go attacking your country. Don't go attacking Canada. It's not Canada, it's one man. It's not necessarily even his whole cabinet. It's one man, Mr. Diefenbaker, and he's wrong. Well, I think I won them over. And then I did something that was rather, I knew then that I had to win the Canadian people. And I decided that I would travel from coast to coast in Canada and present Newfoundland's case. We had an ironclad case. Our case was perfect. Our case was correct. It was accurate. It was correct. There was no falseness in it. There was no blunder in it. There was no weakness in it. It was a perfect case. We had joined Canada. We had accepted the terms of Confederation. And these terms included one term, term 29. There were a lot of terms. And term 29 was really the last word in simplicity. Here we were in Ottawa negotiating the terms of Confederation. And we were going to cease to be a country, cease to be a nation, a very little nation, but a nation, and become a province of another nation. Therefore, our tax system would be different. We wouldn't have any customs duties. The customs are federal, not provincial. We would have income tax if we wanted it. We could have a sales tax. There are certain taxes that a province can have and some that a province cannot have. Whereas the government, the Parliament of Canada can put on any mode or manner, I think those are the words in the Constitution, any mode or manner of taxation, but a province cannot. A province can put on taxation only within its own borders. The province of Newfoundland cannot tax the province of Ontario or British Columbia or Nova Scotia. It can tax only the people of their own province. And the taxation must be direct. Direct. It can't be indirect. But the Parliament of Canada can put on any kind of taxation. There's no limit at all to the kind of taxation that the Government of Canada can put on. Well, now we would become a province. We would be limited to the kind of taxes we could put on. And would that be enough? Would that get us enough revenue to run the province? Could we run the schools? Could we build schools? Could we pay teachers' salaries? Could we build roads? Could we pave roads? Could we build hospitals? Could we run the hospitals? Could we do this and that and the other out of the revenue that we'd be allowed to get with provincial taxation, you see? Could we? We didn't know. Ottawa didn't know. We sat there for days. Now, I'm the one who negotiated that particular term, and the Canadian was Professor Bert Mackay, who was formerly of Dalhousie University and who afterwards became an ambassador, I think, to Norway. And anyway, he was an ambassador. Now, he was quite a man, and he was appointed by the Canadian government, and I was appointed. The two of us sat for days, and I'll never forget this. His office in West Block. You see, Parliament building is here. There's a building there, and there's a building here. And he was in that building there. As you stand in the front door, there's the one over to the left. And that's the one where the Prime Minister had his office. The one over here was another building. So in his office, it was in July, I guess, we'd be in there with the door locked. And I took off my coat and my shirt and my tie and my collar and stripped to the waist. And even then you'd sweat. It was July in August, in October, you know. He was more accustomed to that kind of heat. And we'd work till lunchtime, and then all the notes that we had made, he'd gather them together and put them through a shredder so that nobody could ever get them and read them, you see. It was very, very secret. We went on like that for 2 or 3 days, drafting that clause. And the clause was really quite simple, Clause 29, really quite simple. It said, owing to the difficulty of predicting with sufficient accuracy how Confederation would turn out in Newfoundland once we became a province, the difficulty of predicting how it would turn out tax-wise. Would there be enough revenue from the taxes we were allowed under the Canadian Constitution that we were allowed to impose on the Newfoundland people? Would that taxation really be enough to enable the government of the new province to do the things that the Constitution required the province to do, that Ottawa did not have to do, that the province did have to do? Would there be enough revenue? Suppose it turned out after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years that we could not. We couldn't maintain the services that were supposed to be maintained, that were there already, nor could we start any new services. And here would be Newfoundland, a new province, starting her life, her career as a province, way down below the other provinces. Well, you know, you couldn't have that. So, yet we didn't know. Their experts didn't know. Our experts didn't know. I guess I was as much an expert as any of our experts, and I didn't know where the money was going to come from, or if enough money would come to pay our way. We had to pay our way. You see, the Constitution of Canada says the provinces shall operate the schools. The school system belongs to the province, and Ottawa has nothing to do with it. The province has to do it. The building of roads is provincial. The building of hospitals is provincial. The various provincial things. Would there be enough money? So as we couldn't tell, and Ottawa couldn't tell the Ottawa experts, we had to write a clause in to take care of that situation. Suppose it turned out that the grants that Ottawa was giving us, all put together, would not be enough. We wouldn't have enough to run the show, to keep the shop going. See? The clause said, owing to the difficulty of predicting with sufficient accuracy, now that's a bit of a joke, because you couldn't come within a mile of being accurate, you know. It certainly wouldn't be with sufficient accuracy, to be with practically no accuracy. Owing to the difficulty of predicting with any accuracy, or with enough accuracy, whether the revenue of the government under the taxes that would be put on would be enough to enable Newfoundland to operate at a level roughly the same as the 3 maritime provinces. They took the Maritimes as a yardstick, as a benchmark, as a measuring rod, you know. Would we, as a new province, be able to operate at the same level that those 3 provinces, now not Ontario, not British Columbia, not Quebec, not Alberta, but those 3 provinces, could we equal them? Could we run along even on a par with them, with the revenue that we were getting? Well, now, of course, remember that you could put very little. You could put lower levels and lower rates of taxes on the people of Newfoundland than the government of Nova Scotia was putting on the people of Nova Scotia, or New Brunswick or PEI were putting on their peoples. We could try to get away with putting a lower level, you see what I mean? That wouldn't be fair, that wouldn't be just. So it had to be without imposing levels of taxation higher than the levels in the three maritime provinces. But you might put on, say, 80% of what they were putting on. Put 80% of their level on our people, and that 80% might be higher than the level in their provinces. Because there was another thing that had to be taken into account: capacity to pay. The capacity of the Newfoundland people to pay taxes. Maybe the Newfoundland people wouldn't be able to pay taxes, say, more than 50, 60, 70% as high as the taxes in Nova Scotia and the other provinces. So the two yardsticks were, have we got public services as good as those of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI? Our levels, our roads are going to be as good, as many roads built, as much paving, as many hospitals as good, as many schools as good. You know, generally the public services of Newfoundland, would we be able to maintain those services at a level equal to the services of the same things in those provinces, without having to levy taxes higher than they were raising? But that's only one test. The other test is the capacity of each province to pay. If we paid at the full capacity, that might only amount to 80% of the revenue that the other provinces were getting. And that's what Ottawa agreed to make good. That we would get enough revenue. If we couldn't raise it ourselves, they'd pay it to us, provided we were levying taxes as heavy as those in the three provinces nearby, having capacity to pay, you see, in mind.
They'd make up the difference.
They'd make up the difference. Well, all right. And for 8 years, they were going to pay us this much a year, the first year, this much a bit less the second year, and each year, for the 8 years, they'd pay us a little less, and then, at the end of 8 years, it would disappear. There'd be none at all, you see. But if you set an amount every year, each year for 8 years, at the end of the 8 years, it all disappears, Newfoundland's position might be absolutely desperate. So what would happen in that case? What would happen in that case is that before the 8 years were over, a royal commission would be appointed to look at the whole picture. What is Newfoundland collecting? How burdensome is that compared with the burdensomeness of the taxes in the three nearby provinces? Were we putting as much of a burden on our people as they were putting on their people? And was that falling short of enough to run the show? See, the Royal Commission. Well, they appointed a Royal Commission, and it was headed by John B. McNair, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New Brunswick, a great friend of mine. He'd been the Premier of New Brunswick, you see. Now he was the Chief Justice. And a doctor, a professor, forget his name, he had been a federal civil servant in Ottawa. Now he was a professor at, I think, Queen's University.
Is it Lyerly?
What name?
Lyerly? Or Lauer?
No, it wasn't either one of those names. And the third was our own Newfoundlander, Sir Albert Walsh. See, the chairman was John B. McNair. Well, they went in, well, before that Royal Commission was appointed, a year before it, I appointed a Newfoundland Royal Commission. And I put Phil Lewis, the lawyer, as chairman of it. I put Gerald S. Doyle as a member of it. I put Albert B. Perlin as a member. I found pretty smart, 5 or 6 smart Newfoundland. And then I brought in Professor Carl Goldenberg, who just retired the other day as a senator. Carl Goldenberg, one of the smartest men in all Canada. I engaged him and brought him in as advisor to our own Royal Commission. And then a girl in Montreal, I hear her now on CBC every now and then. What's her name? She's an economist. She talks about the market, the financial market. She's on about just about every day on CBC. Cohen, is it? Cohen? Anyway. So I had a good commission. They worked for over a year preparing Newfoundland's case for when the Royal Commission would be appointed by Ottawa, you see. And they'd go in before that Royal Commission with an ironclad case. They'd have the facts. And they did. They did a good job. And the Royal Commission came out with a report that would make you break down and cry. It was so miserably inadequate, really. It was miserable. Yet there was a sentence in it that perhaps could be read two ways, one way or the other. And Mr. Diefenbaker read it the wrong way. He said he would do what the Royal Commission, the McNair Royal Commission had recommended, and that was all. But that recommended, look, I forget, as I'm talking to you here now, I forget the actual words of the recommendation. They would pay so much up to that point, and then thereafter, the same amount is the way we read it. But the way Mr. Diefenbaker read it, it was not. We just paid that much up to that year. And then to die. And then it said, in full and complete performance of the term, 29, you see. Well, that was the foulest blow, the worst blow, that was struck at Newfoundland after we became a province. And of course we had to fight. The students began it at the university with their march and carrying the coffin down through the street and meeting in front. And then I took it up, and on every public building, the courthouse on Water Street, we didn't have a Confederation building then, did we? No, we didn't. But wherever there was a government building, I draped that building from ceiling to street, right down. Great, broad streams of black crepe. I dressed all the government buildings in black crepe and declared a public holiday. The opposition party, the Tory party, the Tory opposition party, split wide open. Three of them said they couldn't stomach it. The late Mr. Justice Higgins, James D. Higgins of the Supreme Court, this is before he was a judge of the Supreme Court, came out and said he couldn't stand it. Mr. Duffy came out and said he couldn't stomach that as a Newfoundlander. And there was a third one. And then Mr. Hollett, the leader of the opposition, Malcolm Hollett, came out and said he was absolutely stunned. He was puzzled. He couldn't understand it. And then I worked on Malcolm Hollett and tried to persuade him to join with Jim Higgins and Malcolm Hollett and Duffy. Not Malcolm Hollett, Jim Higgins and Gus Duffy. I think there was a third one, to join with them, but he wouldn't. And what happened was that in the end, he broke away from them completely. They broke away from the party. They formed a new political party, the United Newfoundland Party, I think. And they ran as candidates in the election that followed right after that. Here in St. John's they ran. And I met with them, of course, and they met with me. And they thought it was better, and I agreed it was better, that they would not run as Liberals. They ran as United Newfoundland Party, you see. But I didn't put a candidate against them. And they were elected. But Malcolm Hollett, the leader, in the end decided that he would stand by his party, the Tory party, the Progressive Conservative Party. And he did. And he ran in St. John's West in the election that came, and I ran in St. John's West. And I told him, I said, Malcolm, and he went down with me to Labrador to Churchill Falls. And he was terribly, terribly impressed by Churchill Falls, what he saw there. We went right to the brow of the falls, he and I together. I remember some of the trees right there at the edge of the falls, of Churchill Falls. The trees that were so big that he and I both tried to put our arms around the trunk of a tree. We couldn't do it. And one tree, the two of us had to put our arms around that tree, and our hands met, you know, he on one side and I on this side, and I had a huge tree. And he was delighted that I invited him down there. He was leader of the opposition. But I wanted him to see Churchill Falls. I also wanted to have a talk with him. I also wanted to try to persuade him, Malcolm, you're a Newfoundlander, you're a Canadian, you're a Newfoundlander, you're a Confederate, whatever you were in the past, you're a Confederate now. You've got to join in Newfoundland's fight. We've got to fight Mr. Diefenbaker. He couldn't bring himself to do it. And I said, look, if you don't, Malcolm, wherever you run, whatever district you run in as a candidate, I'll be there. And I won't only be there to campaign against you, I'll be there as the candidate, the Liberal candidate. Well, he said, if you do, you'll beat me. I said, yes, that's right, I'll beat you. But I said, Malcolm, I don't want to beat you. I don't want you to be beaten. I want you to join on Newfoundland's side. And he couldn't do it. So he ran in St. John's West, and I ran in St. John's West. And I must confess I had a lot of fun, and I beat him. For every vote he got in St. John's West, I got 2, which was 2-1. But Malcolm, you know, was a magnificent example of a man. He was a prime example, really he was. Example of a man standing by his party. Now there's something in me that applauds that. I like a man to stand by his party. If it's worth standing by, if the party is right, if it stands for the right principles and the right practices, then every man who's been elected as a Liberal should stand by the Liberal Party. And every man who's elected as a Tory should stand by the Tory Party, or any other party. He should stand by the party that he stood for when he went to the people, provided always that the principles of that party, its principles, what it stands for, its program, its platform, its philosophy, its ideology, if it's something that you can run for, and if it isn't, you shouldn't run, you shouldn't be a candidate. So if you are a candidate, it should be because you support that party and what it stands for. And he stood for the Tory party and he was elected. Then he had to ask himself, have I turned against Toryism? Have I turned against Tory philosophy? Have I turned against Tory principles? Have I turned against Tory ideology? No, I haven't. It's true that I don't like the policy of Mr. Diefenbaker on term 29. I don't like that. But that doesn't mean that I've become a Liberal. That doesn't mean that I've ceased to be a Tory. I am still a Tory and I'm going to run for the Tory party. It was really, and mind you now, I will say this. Did he at any time say, my loyalty to the Tory party, Tory principles, Tory policy, Tory ideology, my loyalty to all that, does it supersede my loyalty to Newfoundland? Which comes first? If he asked himself that question, no doubt, he said, I think Mr. Diefenbaker is wrong on that one thing, term 29. I think he's wrong. But I still am a Tory. And I'm going to stand by the Tory party. And he got his reward. He didn't do it for that reward. The last thing I would imagine that was in Malcolm Hollard's mind. When he took the stand, he did. And ran as a Tory candidate in St. John's West against me. Knowing that I was going to run, I had to warn him. I said, Malcolm, wherever you run, I'll run, you know. I'm going to defeat you. He said, yes, Joe, I know you would, and I believe you will. I believe you'll defeat me. But I've got to run according to my principles, you see. Anyway, he ran, and he was defeated, and Mr. Diefenbaker put him in the Senate. And he served there till he reached the age limit. I would say that Malcolm Hollett was a pretty good Newfoundlander. He might be muddled. You know, every good Newfoundlander is not necessarily clear-headed and clear-minded. The greatest patriots may be muddled. Anyway, that's the story. Altogether different kettle of fish, a different situation from this other thing that you were comparing it with. What was it? I've forgotten it now.
With the present Premier's attitude on the offshore.
On the offshore, yeah. You see, the present Premier took advice, apparently, from two men. One was Cabot Martin. I believe that Cabot Martin is a perfectly decent fellow. But I wouldn't have him as an office boy. I wouldn't hire Cabot Martin as an office boy in my office. I had office boys when I was Premier in those 23 years, smart, far cleverer. I had Jim Channing, the great Jim Channing. I had him right there in my office. I had Gordon Pushy. You know, I had Ed Roberts. I had, if you could call them office boys, you know, which you hardly do, but they were there as my assistants. And Brian Peckford had Cabot Martin. I wouldn't have Cabot Martin as an office boy. I wouldn't think him sufficiently able, sufficiently competent, sufficiently clever, sufficiently brainy. I wouldn't have him. And if I did, I would treat him as a sort of a joke, and if he had been a strong party worker and supporter, you know, and had been a clever politician and helped me to get elected, I might have given him a job there in the office somewhere, you know, but I wouldn't depend on him. Mr. Peckford apparently depends on him, takes his advice. Well, the same thing applies to Walter Marshall. Walter Marshall never in all his life, I don't know how old Walter is, or Bill, not Walter, William Marshall. I don't know how old he is, but I've known him or of him for, let us say, 30-odd years. Well, 30 years ago, he wouldn't be very big, and he wouldn't be very old. But I have never known him to have any job of any consequence whatsoever. He's not used to making big decisions. He's not accustomed. He's never had any practice in getting at the bottom of great problems and coming to a sound and sensible solution. And those are the two men, Bill Marshall and Cabot Martin, advising the Premier of this province, who himself, remember, had no experience whatsoever. I believe he might have been a welfare officer for a little while. God knows that's good, useful background, to have been a welfare officer, to have seen poverty, to have seen people in need. There's so much of that in Newfoundland, and always was so much, that it's a pretty valuable thing for a politician to have, experience of poverty. If he hasn't had it in his own life, in his own family, then if he was a welfare officer for a while, he would see it in other families, and that helps to give a man some compassion for poor people. It helps to make him realize that everybody is not rich, everybody is not comfortable, everybody hasn't got everything they want. That's useful, that's valuable. And then he taught school. And I said once or twice in speeches across Canada at universities that I had a piggery in Gander. In fact, I had a piggery before that in Kenmont Road. I had a piggery, and then I went to Gander and I had a piggery, and that I had learned an awful lot. about pigs, that I had learned about both kinds of pigs, those with 4 legs and those with 2. And wherever you are, in whatever walk of life, you can learn if you are a learnable kind of fellow, if you can learn, if you're eager to learn. And teaching school for 4 or 5 or 8 years, whatever it was, I would say that he was bound to learn something. But did he learn the kinds of things at the depth and the width and the breadth, the things to run a province? Did he? I don't think he did, and it's because he did not that he depended on Bill Marshall and Cabot Martin.
Speaking of energy ministers, provincial energy ministers, what do you think of the move a while ago now of the then energy minister for the province, Leo Barry, break with Peckford over the oil negotiations? Your opinion, was Barry right to do this? We're talking about party loyalties a while ago. How do you see that situation?
I understand that Mr. Barry is a loyal Tory. He's been a Tory just about all his life. No doubt about that. He's a Tory. And as he's a lawyer, a university man, I would assume, I don't know, I would assume that he has done some study and some reading about the philosophy of Toryism, the ideology of Toryism, what Toryism means, what it means to be a Tory. You don't join a Tory party unless you're a nothing and nobody. You don't join a Tory party because you think they're going to win. You don't join a Tory party because you don't like the shape of the nose of the leader of the Liberal Party. You don't join a Tory party, surely, to goodness, an educated man, a university man, especially a lawyer. You don't join a Tory party unless you are a Tory. You believe in Toryism, in the Tory ideology of life, the Tory approach to life, the Tory approach to government, the Tory approach to education, the Tory approach to the country's or the province's economy, the Tory approach. There is such a thing as the Tory approach. Just think of the great Tories of England, the great leaders of the Tory party. Think of the great leaders of the Liberal Party, and you'll see the great gulf between them, the ideologies, the philosophies, you see. Well, I would have assumed that Barry was a man who could give you, who could spell the word Toryism, Toryism, and he wouldn't say I-Z-M, he would have said I-S-M, Toryism. He could have spelled it. He could define it. He could give you a definition of it. He could give you an explanation of it, because I would assume that he is a Tory by conviction, by belief. He is a Tory because he believes in Toryism, and he believes in Toryism because he knows what Toryism is. That's what I would assume, you see. So therefore, it could well be that he would look at Mr. Peckford in action in his confrontation with Ottawa. His conduct as Premier of Newfoundland, it could be that he would look at that and say, that's not Toryism. That's not Toryism. That's just stupidity. That's just silliness. That's just personal animosity. That's got nothing to do with the great, deep, broad principles of Toryism that Lord Beaconsfield, the great Disraeli, and the other great Tory leaders, Lord Salisbury, and so on. That's got nothing to do with that. That's just petty confrontation. And if he opposed that and attacked it, that doesn't mean that he has ceased to be a good Tory, you see. But my answer is I don't really know, you know.
Why?
I don't know his reasoning. Is it just ambition? Is he saying, well, now, Brian Peckford has been wrong so many times, and he hasn't been right even once. He's been wrong on offshore. He's been wrong on the fisheries. He's been wrong on Churchill Falls. He's wrong. He's never right. And the people are going to get fed up with him They're going to lose faith in them. At the best, the people are going to say, he's a nice young fellow, Brian Peckford. Fine young fellow, decent young fellow, means well, patriotic. But probably, if he had to, he'd probably give his life for Newfoundland. He's a good man, a good Newfoundlander. But he's got no weight. He doesn't know what is the right thing to do. He's wrong. He's just wrong. He's a menace. He's bad for Newfoundland. And people are going to see that more and more and more, and there's going to be a revolution in the Tory party, and I'll come in for the leadership. Now, it might be that. I don't know. If it were, it would not be the first time that men have behaved that way, you know. Look at Mr. Crosby. Look at Mr. John Crosby. He's a very good example of that sort of thing. And there have been others.
Yes, just recently he's announced this the second time, this time with the federal
Yeah,
party.
yeah.
You were talking a few minutes ago about the training of a premier. In the case of Mr. Peckford, his being a welfare officer and later a teacher. Just to go back to your own early experience, you started out in your first employment in St. John's as a printing company with the Evening Telegram.
No. I had 3 jobs before I was on the Evening Telegram as a reporter. I went to work on the Plain Dealer as a printer's apprentice, a printer's devil. And when they got in a linotype, about 6-7 months after I went to work there was no job for me because the linotype did what I was doing, setting type by hand, you know. Every word in the Plain Dealer was set up. Each individual letter was a separate piece of metal, a separate piece of type. And the letters were assorted in a case, little compartments, and the letter A and the letter B, and you'd pick the letters up and you'd make a line of type. Then you begin the next line, and when you get 6 or 8 lines, you'd have to, a bunch of little individual types, you understand. You had to know how to get it out of the case, out of the frame that you had it in, and lay it down without the whole thing collapsing. Then you'd set up another full, and you'd have to get that out and lay it down on top. And so you get column after column. When they got in a linotype that set one line of type, a solid piece of metal, not individual letters. And you'd operate it with it like a typewriter. You'd touch the keys, and the matrices would drop down and form a line, and then you'd push a handle, and it would go up and go in, and the hot metal would come up against it and squirt and make one slug, one line of type, you see. Well, I wasn't needed. So I went up and got a job then in a little newspaper, a weekly called The Spectator. That was up in Theatre Hill, owned and run by a man named Wiseman. He was there by himself, and he needed a helper, and I was able to set type. I'd been setting it for some months. And then he failed. He folded. And then I got a job at the Daily News, again as a printer's apprentice. And then for a year, then for the next year, I was an office boy going around collecting bills and also delivering newspapers. And I had some beautiful adventures, beautiful adventures. There was one, well, I'll tell you two. One was a judge of the Supreme Court. And the bill that he owed the Daily News was about 7 years for delivery of the paper every day to his house for 7 years, and you hadn't paid a bill, you know. And the paper was still going to that house, his house, you see. So if he was a Supreme Court, I, in my innocence, thought the place to see him was go down to the Supreme Court. So down I went, and I knocked on the door of this judge, and he's come in, and I went in. I said, "Sir, I'm looking for Judge so-and-so," naming the judge, you know. "Oh," he said, "you are?" I said, "Yes. Yes, sir." Now, he was a judge, but I didn't know it, you know. I just knocked on the door. And I said, "Judge so-and-so, is he here?" He said, "No, he's not here." Well, I said, where is he?" He said, "Let's see if we can find out." He said, "You come with me." And we came out and went along the corridor to the next door, and he opened the door and went in. There was another judge. There were 3 judges, you see. He said, this young man is a bill collector from the Daily News, and he has a bill for Judge so-and-so, naming the judge, you see. And he wants to know where to find him. Can you advise him where? And he said, no, I can't tell him where he'd find him. He said, well, let's go. And he came out, and we went down to the third judge, who was the Chief Justice, Sir William Horwood. See? And he goes in and he said, Chief, this is a young man from the Daily News, and he is collecting bills. And he has a bill for Judge so-and-so, naming the judge, you see. And he wants to know where he'd find him. He said, Judge so-and-so doesn't know, I don't know, and we wondered if you'd know. And Sir William Horwood said, no, he said, I don't know, but I know it's one or other of two places. It's heaven or, what's the other place? That's not heaven and it's not hell. It's
Purgatory.
Purgatory. He says it's either heaven or it's purgatory. But young man, he said, I can't tell you which. Then it began to dawn on me that the man was dead. And he'd been dead for years, for several years, but the paper had been delivered every day. Another one was an aristocratic merchant on Water Street. God in heaven, was he aristocratic? He really was aristocratic, filthy rich, head of a great and famous corporation. And I had a bill for his wife, Lady so-and-so. He was Sir so-and-so. And I went in, and I asked the man at the outside office, is Sir so-and-so in? Yes, he's in there. You go down that corridor, the third door down. And I went down, tapped, come in, and I went in. This man sat as stiff as a ramrod up in his desk. And he turned around and turned the chair around. And he looked at me, looked down over at his nose at me. And I said, sir, I was a little disconcerted, I'd never run into that in Newfoundland before. I have since, but not before, up to then. And I said, sir, I have a bill for Lady so-and-so. For the paper, delivering the paper every day at her house. Now, he'd been separated from her for about 7 or 8 years. He hadn't laid an eye on her for years, They were separated, you see. Not divorced. There was no divorce, but he was separated. He just turned away from me. He didn't open his mouth once. He just looked at me, and he stared down his nose, and then he swung around and went on working. And I got the hint. I went out. I worked for about a year delivering papers and collecting money and collecting bills for advertising and so on and so on. And then, the great miracle occurred. Was it a miracle? The Evening Telegram advertised for a reporter. Now, here was I, in those 2 years at the Daily News, writing pieces for the Fisherman's Advocate and taking them down on the wharf where their office was, their office and their printing plant on the wharf, and I would slip it in through the letterbox. Because I was sort of too shy to see them, And they were printing these letters of mine. And I used an underplume Avalon, and they would appear. And this went on for about a year. And then I got into the politics of it. Began writing political stuff, you see. And one day, the article I had written for the Advocate. Now, the Daily News was Tory, where I worked. They were a Tory paper. Not the staff, but the paper was Tory,
Editorial politics.
Yeah. And the article that I had written for the Advocate fell out of my pocket. And one of the fellows picked it up. And, of course, he knew right away who it was. And he passed it around to every employee of the Daily News, read it, and had all read it. Not the staff, not the editorial staff, or the business staff, but the rest of the staff. And then they put it on the desk where I'd find it. And I wondered if anybody had seen it. I found out afterwards. So, here is this advertisement in the Telegram. Wanted a reporter. And here was I, dying to write, to work on a newspaper, not as a printer, but as a writer, you see. And I applied for the job and got it. I became premier, and I've had various honors piled on me. I've had 11 universities make me a doctor. I had the Blackfoot tribe of the Blood Indians of Western Canada make me a chief. And I've been made a chief of the Order of St. Henry, Prince Henry the Navigator, and a whole lot of honors. But that being made a reporter on the Evening Telegram in 1918, I guess, that was something. Never will anything ever equal that. A reporter. The last word in romance, the last word among all the world's heroes, among all the world's great personalities, to be a reporter. And here was I, a reporter. And you know what? I got $12 a week. And when W.J. Herder, the owner of that paper, questioned me, and I said, all right, come to work Monday morning, and your pay will be $12. I thought he meant $12 a month. I did. I was proud, and $12 every month. It was $12 a week. Oh, what a glory that was. That was a glory.
What did, you became a reporter in and around St. John's. What did that do?
For 2 years. I ended up editor. What happened was, what happened was that Charles T. James, James, was the editor. And he decided to run in 1919 as a candidate for the Tory party. And he ran up in Burgeo-Lapoil district. And so the paper was without an editor. And I had been so energetic as a reporter. I had got more scoops, and I had done more stories for the Telegram than anybody up to that time. And they'd been running from 1867 or around there. They've been running for the best part of 50 years, you see. And I turned in, I was very active and energetic, and I was a good reporter. And so old man Herder called me, and he said, now Mr. James has gone off campaigning in his district. I'd like you to be the editor. And I was the editor for 4 or 5 weeks. Now, it's true that he asked a man who had been the editor before, Harry Winter, H.A. Winter, the lawyer, who was afterwards a commissioner, a member of the Commission of Government, H.A. Winter, a brother of J.A. Winter, and a son of the great Sir James Winter, J.S. Winter. He had been the editor of the Telegram before Charlie James. Now his office was across the street from the Telegram in the Board of Trade building, and I had to take my editorials over to him each time. And he'd look it over to see that I didn't say anything outrageous, as a lawyer and as a former editor. And I remember, the only thing I really remember his ever saying to me was this. I had a sentence in which, I was talking about traffic and the pedestrians and traffic and motor cars. And motor cars about 1919 were getting to be a bit plentiful, you see. And the question arose, who had the priority? Who had first claim on the streets? The motor car drivers or the pedestrians? And my belief was it was the pedestrians, and I said so. And he said, now you'll have to change that. I have to advise you as a lawyer, pedestrians don't have any priority. A citizen is a citizen, whether he's walking or driving. Harry Winter.
That was his advice.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've just got the signal for the end of the first tape, so we can break here now. It's about 10 to 4. I suppose probably we should conclude Dale wants to speak to before we
All right.
get back.
All right.
That's fascinating.
Now, I'm going away tomorrow morning and be back, I think, on Thursday.